Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. F. Scott Field, and I've got with me today one of the busiest men in show business, Dr. Ryan Martin. Ryan, thanks for taking the time, man. How the heck are you?
I am good, sir. I am very good. I appreciate you having me on. I've been looking forward to this all week, so thank you so much.
Absolutely. Well, Ryan, tell our audience a little bit about your academic journey and how it's led you to where you're at today.
Sure. Not to go into too much depth, but my background academically, my first degree was in psychology with a minor in religion. And so from that point, I went to biochemistry on my way to medical school. And then I switched my idea of medical school. I worked in an orthopedic clinic and I saw the burnout. I saw a lot of things going on in the ortho world. And one of the orthopedic surgeons was like, "Hey, why don't you go down to PT and follow this patient?" Because, I used to work in surgery. "Hey, why don't you go follow this patient?" And I did. And I got to meet the director of the rehab of PT. And I was like, "Man, I really like this." And so I switched all my applications and everything from med school. I went to PT school. So I went to PT school up in North Dakota. And then my first job out of there was in Hawaii. So I lived in Hawaii for a little bit. And then my grandfather got sick in Arizona. So I moved to Arizona and I met some people that were training MSK, musculoskeletal ultrasound. And at the time, I had no idea what that was. And they said, well, they had this residency mentorship. They were still just kind of getting it going. It wasn't credentialed through the APTA or anything like that. But they said, they have a very, specific program for you to try. And so I did it. So I did that for about a year and a half. It was about an 18-month program under the knowledge and tutelage of sports medicine physicians and with other physical therapists. And so I traveled all over the country and went to different programs. I did a lot of education through that. And then I finally sat for my board certification in musculoskeletal ultrasound. So that's my education background. It's very diverse. I mean, it really started out in psychology and ended up in imaging. So, let's figure that one out, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I love it, man, because musculoskeletal ultrasound is not one of the more popular certifications out there. There's not many people who have that certification. So it's neat to get to talk to somebody who went down that road and is using it in various different ways in really interesting settings and opportunities. So let's dive into the meat and potatoes a little bit about today's episode. And I think you're the perfect fit for this because it's really about thinking outside the box, right? I know this guy lives, eats, and breathes thinking outside the box based on his podcast and all the other things he's doing. Ryan, why do you think it's so important that we as healthcare providers or healthcare professors or healthcare students have to start thinking outside the box?
Well, there's a time and place for contained education, for a linear education. There's a time and place to take a didactic linear approach, right? But if you want to learn and grow and get the synapses firing and getting new knowledge and things that you weren't expecting to happen, like experimentation, you can't just have that linear approach all the time, because when you have a set expectation and you do the things that rote over and over and over, what your expectations are going to be. But once you start thinking outside the box, you start flourishing and things bloom and things start, making changes. Like, wait, I never would have thought of that if I hadn't done this. And that changed a whole different parallel, thought process. It's like that whole, back to the future thing. If you change one thing back here, how many things will change in the future? But if you stayed on your current course, don't expect massive changes, right? And so my thought on thinking outside the box is really to expand and develop new concepts that we haven't really thought of.
Yeah, I love that because again, I tell my students a lot that, hey, look, we're going to teach you the gold standard textbook stuff, right? But when you get out there in the real world, not many of your patients are going to be that gold standard textbook, right? When we joke around and say it depends, we're serious too, because it really does depend. And the reason that you're getting paid the quote unquote big bucks is to figure out the why it depends, right? And then how to act accordingly. And so you're going to get thrown curveballs. You're going to get put in situations where you're just not sure and you don't know and you got to figure it out. So thinking outside the box to me is served me well over my years. You know, it's like if you just assume things are going to be crazy and haywire, like you should be ready and prepared to figure things out on your own that aren't gold standard textbook stuff, you know?
Oh, 100%. I can't imagine too many times that I had followed a patient or a protocol where it fit directly in that box, like where that patient was like, "Yeah, you're 100% exactly what we expected." Like I can probably put this on one hand on how many times that fit directly in from a textbook. So if you're not thinking on your feet, or if you've not challenged yourself outside the box, you're not going to be ready for that or life.
Yeah, I love that takeaway, man. That's again the last I would say 5 to 7 years of my career have really been focused on getting comfortable being uncomfortable, right? Iron sharpens iron type stuff, putting myself in situations that I know I have no idea what the heck is going to happen, how I'm going to do it, but the hell with it. I'm just going for it and I'll figure it out, right? And again,
Yeah.
that's really helped, being adaptable, like, getting used to situations that are difficult or tough or, not easy to navigate. I've gotten a lot better at handling things just by throwing myself off the deep end and figuring out how to swim.
Oh my gosh, you were preaching to like my current status. You know what I mean? Like you're like talking right up my alley right now, like with, iron sharpens iron, be comfortable getting uncomfortable. Like this, these are our credos from our clinical side to our, daily life. I mean, you're nailing it 100% right now.
Yeah, so Ryan, let's talk about this then. Like, what are some tips, some tricks, some pointers that you would give to, say, students, healthcare students, or even professors trying to teach to those students when it comes to thinking outside the box? How do you like to do things and get uncomfortable and try new stuff and figure things out?
Well, I mean, obviously, like we said, you have to have that foundational baseline of knowledge. When you look at CAPD, have criteria, right? And they have the way that you're supposed to teach and the things that you're supposed to teach. I say you need to be comfortable with that, right? First, but at the same time, if you're going to be teaching things that are parallel or off the beaten path, for me, I just start small. I take small bites. Now, again, there's some people that are like trial by fire, and learn as you go. For me, like I'll take small bites of things that are way out there, and I'm like, all right, does it make sense for how I'm practicing? Does it have literature? What bad could happen out of this? So for students that are out there and they want to expand their brain, I would say learn things that are outside of what you're learning right now. So it's similar to how I train like athletes. Okay, so say you have an athlete who's a runner, right? I'm an elite, marathon runner, right? But on off season or on off times, I'm doing cross training. Now I don't say CrossFit. I think that's an interesting terminology, but I cross train my athletes. So I'm getting them doing, motions in lateral components, rotational components, things that their body's not necessarily always doing in a marathon run. I put them through weight training. I put them through different ballistic things. And you'd be surprised on how much growth they have outside, and their marathon and their running statistics by cross training them. I think the brain, as we think as like a muscle, is if we get those synapses that are offset to what we're just so ingrained in doing, especially in school. Because like think about school, it's like, all right, medical, 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 right? And then so like myself and a couple of the doctors here, when we have residents or fellows or even PT students, this is what we do, and this is no joke. Our style, and this is kind of one of our things, is we throw in 80s movie trivia, we throw in like music trivia, we throw in things that their brains like, whoa, whoa, back it up a little bit. What just happened here? And now their brains thinking of different things, and we get them sidetracked, and then we bring them back in, we reel them in, we reel them in. And that's thinking outside of the box because you're going to start building these thought processes that are not on that linear path that I talked about.
Yeah, that's a really good way to approach things. There was a documentary recently on quarterbacks, right? And it showed Patrick Mahomes and some of his training that he does, and it is some weird and wild stuff and movements and putting yourself in these weird situations. But ironically enough, they converted over and transferred over to game type situations where he's fallen in a weird motion and he's still able to make a ridiculous throw without even looking because he's been put in those weird situations before, right? And there's a couple of good studies out there that show like specializing in sports early on and just doing that one sport, not the greatest outcome, not the way we should go about it, right? So put your kids in a bunch of different sports, let them try stuff, and those things will all transfer over eventually to whatever sport they end up loving and leaning into, you know? So I think the brain
Yeah.
can work the same way, you know?
Yeah, really, that's kind of what I'm getting at is to think outside the box. You have to start thinking things that are outside the box, outside of what your pathway is. And like I said, when we started adding trivia and random things and making students answer those on the fly, you'd be surprised how quick they start answering other questions. Now, I'm not a neurologist, I can't put the studies behind it. I can give you anecdotal, of what we did in our clinics. And I tell you what, it's a game changer for us.
Yeah. So tell us, I mean, you've had some really cool life experiences, man. I love seeing what you've been up to. Tell us a little bit about some of the cool experiences that you've had, some of the neat opportunities that have come up because you've decided to kind of go against the grain and go outside the box and think bigger and educate bigger.
Yeah. Well, I think kind of laying down the pathway of when I got out of school and I was very focused on what I was trained in. I was very focused. I was like, all right, I'm a PT. This is what I do. This is our, don't go outside those lines, heaven forbid, like you veer away. And when I started, thinking outside the box and challenging those and doing other things like the MSK ultrasound has opened more paths in my life than almost anything that I can think of. Not only did it help me from an educational point of view, because now I teach it, right? It's also put me in positions to where I've been able to talk to pro sports teams. I've gone to big hospital groups. I've got to travel all over. I get to teach. I guess I can say this now as I teach internationally. I get to teach on a big scale with massive conferences. I get to hang out with like, the UFC was fun. I get to hang out with pro baseball stuff. I'm working with an NHL team, NBA team, so I get to do a lot of really fun stuff that I would never have dreamed of doing. And then I put myself in a creative scenario that I've never thought of doing in teaching. And if anyone follows me on LinkedIn, I know I'm a little zany. I do things a little bit differently, but it has worked out for me.
Yeah. But that's why I love you, man. I love watching your stuff because it makes me think like, oh, that's a really neat approach at it. I don't even care about the musculoskeletal stuff and the PT stuff and like I just like the process in which you teach it, right? The I love great educators. And that's what really drew me to you was the thought process on how to transfer the knowledge. That to me is an art form, and really great teachers can do it very well. And it doesn't like I just thought after 15 years of being in the clinic, got my EDD, I can just show up and teach on day one, right? And profess. I just know all the things, right? Turns out that could not be further from the truth. Like I had to learn how to teach, I had to learn how to educate. And so it is an art form, it's hard, it's difficult to do. So how do you approach that? How do you kind of try to get outside of yourself when it comes to coming up with these different ways to make the knowledge land?
Oh my gosh, is it too loud in here?
No, you're good.
Oh, good.
I
All right,
was
let me.
just I was singing your praises, but now I don't know if I want to do that anymore.
I hear you, right? I hear you. Oh my gosh. Yeah, so I was sitting in my car and my phone just said phone overheating.
Yeah, I figured the
Shut off.
the phone battery died. I was like, oh, he's probably on his phone and it died.
No, it overheated. Welcome to Phoenix.
Yeah.
So where were we?
So the question that we kind of left off on was like, you have all these different ways of educating, right? And it really is truly an art form, right? So how do you use the outside the box thinking to make the knowledge transfer and make it stick? Get those light bulb moments.
Right. And I remember we were talking a little bit about like using things that are not medical, using
Hmm.
things that are not, like within that set program, that programming that we have. And
Yeah.
so, like I said, with our residents and our PT students and everybody in between, we throw trivia and things that are way out there. In fact, we'll even do exercises in between to get blood flowing and things like that. So,
Yeah.
uh, but when it comes to like the residency training that I have, um, again, it's very specific to MSK ultrasound, right? But in the meantime, I'll change it up and I'll use all sorts of other ideas. I'll throw in, like, I'll have them do like a small coloring session of anatomy, just to break it
Yeah.
up. As childish as it sounds, the next time that we go and do like an anterior tib, to see like the displacement next to the dorsal pedis, and they're like, "Oh yeah, it's right here." I was like, "How did you know?" Well, I remember coloring that red 5 times.
Yep.
Okay, so I mix it up a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that that becomes necessary for a lot of reasons, right? Like, me, I recently diagnosed with ADHD, right? So like I learn in a bunch of different ways, and I found that that's been helpful for me, breaking it up and trying different things because I used to be a rote memorizer, right? I would just read and highlight, read and highlight, read and highlight, and the whole page would be highlighted, and then I'd just memorize it and dump the knowledge for the next test. And that wasn't really learning, and it took me a whole EDD program to figure that out, right? So
Wow.
it was wild to me once I saw the theory behind learning and then learning how to teach to that learning. I was like, oh, I've been doing it wrong for 20 some odd years. Like, this is wild. And then I just became more and more and more interested in teaching and learning. So it's been a wild journey for me, but I think the best part about it is seeing those light bulb moments, and seeing when you teach something and it lands and it resonates. That to me is the payoff.
That's huge. That's huge. When I teach, I do a lot of social media. And when I'm out there doing the social media and those kind of things, it's hard to tell who's having light bulbs and not, right? But then I'll take some of those same techniques and I'll teach them at the residency, or, I'll show a video and it's a meme of a guy who gets hit by a horse. And then I'll show like a representation of the femur as it broke, and then I'll overlay it with like an imaging sequence, and they're like, oh, because it got hit this direction, you can see where the fracture is, and so they put different thoughts to it. But it was something that I would have never thought to use humor. I would have never thought to use comedy, as something to stick for somebody that's something so medical. And I mean, again, it was about a femoral, sorry, it was a femoral fracture and something that's pretty serious. But I use humor, and like all the students, they all remember it. So it's just challenging what we think is the most appropriate, what we've been told is the most appropriate, and trying new things to see if it sticks. That's where
Yeah.
I'm at.
Yeah, I like that because again, like for me, Sage on a stage didn't really work. Like, it was boring as heck. I was an English major before I was a PT, so that was a tough enough transition, right?
Wow.
So I think the big takeaway message for me is like humor for sure. I love changing things up and breaking it up with humor and storytelling, right? Because I was always pretty decent with English and storytelling, right? And I can recall a bunch of things that happened to me over my career out in the real world and in the clinic, and tell those stories at appropriate times to drop like little clinical pearls and knowledge that, like, hey, this isn't in the textbook, but this really happened, and you may come across something like that. So just realize this is why it's important, right? um, and like you said, it seems like that stuff really tends to stick a lot better. I know it does with me.
Yeah.
I hope it does with my students, and the professors that I teach. So hopefully, we're getting better at teaching and learning over the years. And I think, I don't know how you feel about this, but I feel like the technology and all the things we're doing, especially with AI, is going to make it a lot better. What are your thoughts on the
That's
direction we're
funny.
heading?
Yeah, it's funny that you say that. Is I don't know, like maybe 5 months ago, I was on a podcast called Everyday AI. And it was really when a lot of things were booming in the medical. I mean, medical's used AI for a lot more years than we give it credit for, especially in the radiology realm. So radiology's been using AI or algorithms for many many years. It's just becoming more mainstream since OpenAI, really came out. So I did a podcast about, like I said, 5 6 months ago for Everyday AI, and one of the questions was, do you use it? And I told him, I said, well, yeah, I'm using it here and there, but the power that we can harness with, I mean, just even large language models, what we can generate with this is unbelievable. And I think the teaching models as we move on with this is going to change dramatically. What we talked about on that podcast was using augmented reality, virtual reality, on a large language model backbone, and what is that going to do for the medical education system, right? There's always going to be need for hands-on. I think that is a necessity, especially in medical, especially 100% in physical therapy. But do I think that AR, VR, and AI are going to have a huge place in it? Absolutely. I just think that we need safeguards and ethics, which
Yeah.
is they're all coming, right? But not bottleneck us with a bureaucratic, safety net.
Yeah, no, we got to embrace it. I mean, you can't. It's already. I mean, we can't put that Pandora back in the box, right? It's already out there
It's
and
out.
doing its thing. So we got to just, like you said, roll with it, embrace it, and then find the ethical approaches. Hopefully, we can do that as they keep popping up little by little. Well,
Yeah,
Ryan,
for
thank
sure.
you, man. I appreciate you for taking the time for coming on and just kind of, sharing your brain with us. We have one final question we ask all of our guests, and that question is if you could change one aspect of higher education, whether it be DPT or otherwise, what aspect would you change and how would you change it?
Well, it's a loaded question because I sit so highly on imaging, right? And what I learned in imaging, and I see what they're teaching. In fact, my business partner, Colin Rigney, teaches in the university level of imaging. I think we could do a better job in imaging. And I think we should utilize MSK ultrasound at a different level. So for me, I think using MSK ultrasound, and I'm not trying to give myself a plug or anything, but look out for the next year or so as I'm writing a book with a big publisher about this exact thing. And this book is going to go into the university level. And it's more about changing the mindset of how we can utilize and incorporate imaging into our daily practice. So if
Yeah.
we can start at the university level, at the PT level, I think it'll change how we interact on the clinical level.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to like the theme of this whole episode here. And it's like, how do we translate the thing, whether it's imaging or learning or a specific topic that we're teaching? How is it translatable to the bigger picture, to other things that are in the same realm, other things that are outside of the same realm, right? It's that mindset. It's that, like, how can I make this make sense over here, so I'm
Right.
excited. I'm excited, man. I can't wait to see it.
I'm super excited too. I don't know if anybody out there has written a book, but it's a challenge.
It is. It is.
And when you have a publisher and an editor on your backside all the time, it changes your daily life. So anyway, I wanted to say thank you so much for having me on. It means a lot to me to talk to people like you who are also thinking outside the box, who are in the space of education because that's my passion, and for us to spread this word and motivate people to do different things. I love it. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Where can people find you on social media and the World Wide Webs should they want to follow up or ask any questions or just see what you're up to?
Well, I mean, should anybody be interested in my shenanigans? Most of my life is spent on LinkedIn, so I think it's just Ryan Martin at LinkedIn. I'm not hard to find. And other social media, outlets I'm not as big on, but LinkedIn. If you find me on LinkedIn, I'll spend time and chat with you.
Awesome. We'll put that in the show notes so everybody can find you easily. Ryan Martin, thank you so much for your time, man.